Before the arrival of Europeans, the land that would become the United States was home to millions of Native Americans for thousands of years. These indigenous peoples developed hundreds of distinct cultures, languages, and societies across the continent. In the Northeast, the Iroquois Confederacy united several powerful nations, including the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. They created a sophisticated political system with councils and alliances that influenced later American democracy. In the Southeast, the Mississippian culture built large cities like Cahokia near present-day St. Louis. Cahokia was a center of trade and religion with massive earthen mounds and a population that may have reached 40,000 at its peak. In the Southwest, the ancestral Pueblones, also known as the Anasazi, constructed impressive cliff dwellings and multi-story buildings in places like Chaca Canyon and Mesa Verde. They developed advanced irrigation systems to farm in the desert on the Great Plains. Nomadic tribes like the Lakota and Cheyenne followed bison herds and lived in portable teepees along the Pacific coast. People such as the Chinook and Tlingit built large wooden houses and crafted totem poles. Native Americans traded goods like shells, copper, and furs across vast distances. Their spiritual beliefs were deeply connected to the land animals and natural forces. They passed down stories and traditions through generations. In 1492, Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean islands, marking the beginning of European exploration in the Americas. Soon after, Spanish explorers ventured into what is now the United States. Juan Ponce de Leon landed in Florida in 1513. Searching for the fountain of youth, Hernando de Soto explored the Southeast, from Florida to the Mississippi River, encountering many Native American societies. Francisco Coronado led an expedition through the Southwest in search of legendary cities of gold. The Spanish established the first European settlement in the present-day United States at St. Augustine, Florida, in 1565. They built missions forts and towns throughout the region. Spanish influence spread to the Southwest and California, where missions like San Diego and San Francisco were founded. The Spanish brought horses, cattle, and new crops to the Americas, but also diseases like smallpox that devastated native populations. In the early 1600s, the English began to establish colonies along the Atlantic coast. In 1607, Jamestown was founded in Virginia by the Virginia Company. The settlers faced many hardships, including disease, hunger, and conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy. John Smith emerged as a leader and helped the colony survive its early years. Tobacco became the cash crop that ensured Jamestown's success. In 1619, the first Africans arrived in Virginia as indentured servants, marking the beginning of African presence in English America. In 1620, a group of English pilgrims seeking religious freedom sailed on the Mayflower and landed at Plymouth in present-day Massachusetts. They signed the Mayflower Compact, an agreement for self-government. Pilgrims struggled through a harsh winter, but survived with help from the Wampanoag people, led by Massasoit the First. Thanksgiving was celebrated in 1621 as a symbol of cooperation. Soon more English settlers arrived in New England and Massachusetts. Bay Colony was founded by Puritans who wanted to build a city upon a hill. Other colonies like Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire were established by people seeking religious or political freedom. In the mid-1600s, the English expanded further south. Maryland was founded as a haven for Catholics. Carolinas grew rice and indigo on large plantations worked by enslaved Africans. Georgia was established as a buffer against Spanish Florida and a place for debtors to start a new age. Colony developed its own government economy, and culture town meetings in New England allowed for local self-rule. House of Burgesses in Virginia was the first elected. Assembly in America. The Dutch also played a role in early American history. They established New Netherland along the Hudson River with its capital at New Amsterdam. Dutch encouraged trade and welcomed people from many backgrounds. In 1664, the English captured New Netherland and renamed it New York. The city became a center of commerce and immigration. French explored and settled the interior of North America. They traveled along the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and the Mississippi River. French explorers like Jacques Cartier, Samuel de Champlain, and Robert de La Salle claimed vast territories for France. They built forts and trading posts in places like Detroit and New Orleans. The French developed close relationships with Native Americans. Through the fur trade, French Jesuit missionaries tried to convert native peoples to Christianity. By the late 1600s and early 1700s, 13 British colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast from New Hampshire to Georgia. The population grew rapidly as immigrants arrived from England, Scotland, Ireland, Germany, and Africa. Colonial society was diverse, with farmers, merchants, artisans, and enslaved people. In the north, small farms and towns dominated it. The south, large plantations produced tobacco, rice, and indigo for export. Slavery became deeply rooted in the southern colonies. Enslaved Africans brought their own cultures and traditions. Shaping American life in the colonies was shaped by hard work and community. Colonists built homes, churches, schools, and businesses. They faced challenges such as harsh winters, disease, and conflicts with Native Americans. King Philip's War in New England and Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia were major conflicts that shaped colonial society. Colonists also competed with French and Spanish settlers for land and resources. Religion played a central role in colonial life. The Great Awakening in the 1730s and 1740s was a religious revival that swept through the colonies. It encouraged people to question authority and seek personal faith. This movement helped lay the groundwork for ideas of liberty and equality. Colonial governments developed systems of self-rule. Elected assemblies made laws and collected taxes. Colonists valued their rights as English subjects, including trial by jury and freedom of speech. However, tensions grew as British officials tried to exert more control over the colonies. Trade and commerce connected the colonies to the wider world. Ships carried goods like tobacco, sugar, rum, and slaves across the Atlantic in a system known as the triangular trade ports like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston became bustling centers of trade. By the mid-1700s, the British colonies in America were prosperous and growing, but they were also becoming more independent in their thinking and actions. The seeds of conflict with Britain were being planted as colonists demanded more rights and less interference from the crown. The colonial era was a time of change and diversity. Native American cultures mixed with European and African influences. New ideas about government, religion, and society took root. The stage was set for the next chapter in American history as the colonies moved toward revolution and independence. By the mid-1700s, the 13 British colonies in North America had grown in population, wealth, and confidence, but tensions with Britain were rising as the British government tried to exert more control and collect more taxes from the colonies. The French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, had just ended in 1763. Britain had defeated France and gained control of vast new territories in North America. But the war left Britain deeply in debt, and the government looked to the colonies to help pay for it. Parliament passed a series of taxes and laws, such as the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Acts. These laws angered many colonists who believed they should not be taxed without representation in Parliament. Colonial leaders like Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and James Otis spoke out against British policies. Protests and boycotts spread throughout the colonies. Groups like the Sons of Liberty organized resistance and sometimes used violence to oppose British officials in 1770. Tensions erupted in violence in Boston when British soldiers fired into a crowd of colonists, killing 5 people in what became known as the Boston Massacre. 3 years later, in 1773, colonists protested the Tea Act by dumping British tea into Boston Harbor. In the event, known as the Boston Tea Party, in response, the British government passed the Coercive Acts, which the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. These laws closed Boston Harbor and took away many rights of self-government from Massachusetts colonists, saw these acts as a threat to their liberty, and began to unite in opposition. In 1774, representatives from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress. They sent a petition to King George III asking for their rights to be restored, but the king refused and tensions continued to rise. In April 1775, fighting broke out between Colonial militia and British troops at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. These were the first battles of the American Revolution. The Second Continental Congress met soon after and appointed George Washington as commander of the Continental Army. War for Independence had begun in 1776. Thomas Paine published Common Sense, a pamphlet that argued for complete independence from Britain. His words inspired many colonists to support the cause of freedom. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. Written mainly by Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration stated that all men are created equal and have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It listed the colonies' grievances against King George and declared that the United States was now a free and independent nation. The Revolutionary War was long and difficult. The British Army was powerful and well-trained, while the Continental Army often lacked supplies and experienced many defeats. But the Americans had strong leaders and the support of local militias. They used guerrilla tactics and knowledge of the land to their advantage. Key battles included the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, which was a turning point because it convinced France to join the war on the American side. French troops and ships helped the Americans win important victories. In 1781, British General Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, Virginia, effectively ending the war. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, officially recognizing American independence and setting the boundaries of the new nation. After the war, the United States faced the challenge of creating a new government. First attempt was the Articles of Confederation, which created a weak central government with most power in the hands of the states. This system proved ineffective, as the government could not collect taxes or regulate trade. Economic problems and unrest such as Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts showed the need for a stronger national government. In 1787, delegates from the states met in Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention. They debated and compromised to create a new constitution. The Constitution established a federal system with 3 branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. It created a system of checks and balances to prevent any one branch from becoming powerful. Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution guaranteed basic freedoms such as freedom of speech, religion, and the press. The Constitution was ratified in 1788, and George Washington was elected the first president of the United States in 1789. The new nation faced many challenges. The government had to pay off war debts, establish a national bank, and create a stable economy. Political parties began to form, with Federalists led by Alexander Hamilton supporting a strong central government, and Democratic Republicans led by Thomas Jefferson favoring states' rights. Foreign relations were also difficult, as the United States tried to stay neutral and conflicts between Britain and France. In 1796, John Adams became the second president. His administration faced problems such as the XYZ affair with France and the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson was elected president in what became known as the Revolution of 1800 because it marked the first peaceful transfer of power between political parties. Jefferson reduced the size of the federal government and cut taxes. In 1803, he made the Louisiana Purchase, buying a vast territory from France that doubled the size of the United States. Lewis and Clark led an expedition to explore the new lands, traveling all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The country continued to expand westward as settlers moved into new territories. Tensions with Britain continued, and in 1812, the United States declared war on Britain. War of 1812 was fought over issues such as British interference with American trade and the impressment of American sailors. The British burned Washington, D.C., but the Americans won key battles at Baltimore and New Orleans. The war ended in 1815 with no clear winner, but it boosted American pride and nationalism. After the War of 1812, the United States entered a period known as the Era of Good Feelings. The economy grew and new states were added to the Union, but conflicts over slavery and the balance of power between free and slave states began to grow. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 allowed Missouri to enter as a slave state and Maine as a free state, keeping the balance in the Senate. It also banned slavery north of the 3630 line in the Louisiana Territory. The 1820s and 1830s. The country experienced rapid change. Andrew Jackson became president and championed the common man. He expanded voting rights to more white men and opposed the National Bank. Jackson's policies led to the forced removal of Native Americans from their lands in the Southeast. The Trail of Tears saw thousands of Cherokee and other tribes forced to march west to Indian Territory, with many dying along the way. The United States continued to expand westward. Settlers traveled the Oregon Trail to the Pacific Northwest. Texas won independence from Mexico in 1836 and joined the United States in 1845. The Mexican-American War followed, and the United States gained vast new territories in the Southwest, including California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 sparked the gold rush and brought thousands of people to the West. As the country grew, so did tensions over slavery. The North and South developed different economies and cultures. The North was more industrial and favored free labor, while the South relied on plantations and enslaved labor. Abolitionists in the North called for an end to slavery. The Underground Railroad helped enslaved people escape to freedom. The Compromise of 1850 tried to ease tensions by allowing California to enter as a free state and passing a strict fugitive slave law. But the issue of slavery continued to divide the nation. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 allowed settlers in those territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. This led to violence known as Bleeding Kansas, as pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers clashed in 1857. The Supreme Court issued the Dred Scott decision, ruling that African Americans were not citizens and that Congress could not ban slavery in the territories. This decision outraged many of the North and further divided the country. Abraham Lincoln emerged as a leader of the new Republican Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery. In 1860, Lincoln was elected president. Some states saw his election as a threat to slavery and began to secede from the Union South. Carolina was the first to leave, followed by others forming the Confederate States of America. The stage was set for the Civil War. The nation was divided over the issues of slavery, states' rights, and the future of the Union. The next chapter in American history would be one of the most difficult and transformative as the country faced its greatest crisis. The Civil War ended in 1865 after 4 years of brutal conflict that left more than 600,000 Americans dead and much of the South in ruins. President Abraham Lincoln's goal was to preserve the Union and end slavery, but just days after the war ended, he was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in Washington, D.C. Vice President Andrew Johnson became president and faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding the nation and bringing the southern states back into the Union. This period is known as Reconstruction, and it lasted from 1865 to 1877. During Reconstruction, the federal government tried to rebuild the South and protect the rights of newly freed African Americans. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery throughout the United States. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to all people born in the United States, including former slaves. The 15th Amendment gave African American men the right to vote. Federal troops were sent to the South to enforce these new laws and protect freedmen from violence and intimidation. Many African Americans took advantage of their new rights by voting, holding public office, and building schools, churches, and businesses. Leaders like Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce became the first African American senators. However, many white Southerners resisted these changes and formed groups like the Ku Klux Klan to use violence and terror against black citizens and their allies. Southern states passed black codes and later Jim Crow laws to limit the rights of African Americans and enforce segregation. Reconstruction ended in 1877 when federal troops were withdrawn from the South as part of a political compromise. White Democrats regained control of Southern governments and began to roll back many of the gains made by African Americans. For the next several decades, the South was marked by racial segregation, disenfranchisement, and economic hardship for black citizens. Meanwhile, the United States was rapidly changing in other ways. The late 1800s saw the rise of industry and the growth of cities. The period known as the Gilded Age was marked by rapid economic growth, but also by corruption and inequality. Railroads connected the country from coast to coast, making it easier to move people and goods. New inventions like the telephone, the light bulb, and the typewriter transformed daily life. Business leaders like Andrew Carnegie in steel, John D. Rockefeller in oil, and Cornelius Vanderbilt in railroads built huge fortunes and dominated the economy. Many workers labored long hours in dangerous conditions for low-pay labor. Unions like the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor formed to fight for better wages and working conditions. Strikes and protests sometimes turned violent, as in the Haymarket Riot of 1886 and the Pullman Strike of 1894. Immigration also transformed the United States. During this period, millions of people came from Europe, Asia, and other parts of the world seeking opportunity and a better life. Ellis Island in New York Harbor became the main entry point for immigrants from Europe. Chinese immigrants helped build the Transcontinental Railroad, but faced discrimination and exclusion. Cities grew rapidly as immigrants and rural Americans moved in search of jobs. Urban life brought new challenges such as overcrowding, poverty, and disease, but also new opportunities for education and culture. The United States continued to expand westward during the late 1800s. The government encouraged settlement of the West through laws like the Homestead Act, which gave land to people willing to farm it. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 made it easier for settlers to move west, but this expansion came at a great cost to Native Americans. The government forced many tribes onto reservations and fought wars to take their land. Famous conflicts included the Battle of Little Bighorn, where Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, defeated General Custer's troops. Massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890 marked the end of armed Native American resistance by the end of the 19th century. The United States had become a major industrial power cities like New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh grew into centers of manufacturing and commerce. The country's population soared, and new technologies changed the way people lived and worked. The progressive era began in the early 1900s as reformers sought to address the problems caused by industrialization leaders like Theodore Roosevelt pushed for reforms to break up monopolies, protect consumers, and conserve natural resources. Women fought for the right to vote and achieved victory with the 19th Amendment in 1920. Progressives also worked to improve working conditions and child labor and make government more responsive to the people. The United States also began to play a larger role in world affairs in 1898. The country fought the Spanish-American War and gained control of territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The construction of the Panama Canal made it easier for ships to travel between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. President Roosevelt's Big Stick policy and the Monroe Doctrine asserted American influence in Latin America. The early 20th century, the United States faced new challenges at home and abroad. War I broke out in Europe in 1914, and the United States tried to remain neutral, but German submarine attacks on American ships and the discovery of the Zimmerman telegram pushed the country toward war. In 1917, the United States entered World War I on the side of the Allies. American soldiers known as doughboys helped turn the tide of the war. War ended in 1918 with the defeat of Germany and its allies. President Woodrow Wilson proposed the League of Nations to promote peace, but the United States Senate refused to join. After the war, the country experienced a period of economic growth known as the Roaring '20s. Inventions like the automobile, radio, and motion pictures changed American life. Jazz music and new styles of art and literature flourished. Women gained more independence and the right to vote, but the decade also saw rising tensions over immigration, race, and religion. The Ku Klux Klan re-emerged and targeted African Americans, immigrants, Catholics, and Jews. Prohibition banned the sale of alcohol but led to the rise of organized crime. The good times ended suddenly in 1929 when the stock market crashed. The Great Depression began and millions of Americans lost their jobs, homes, and savings banks failed. Businesses closed and families struggled to survive. President Herbert Hoover tried to help, but his efforts were not enough. 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president and promised a New Deal for the American people. The New Deal was a series of programs and reforms designed to provide relief, recovery, and reform. The government created jobs, built roads and bridges, and helped farmers and the unemployed. Social Security was established to provide income for the elderly and disabled. The New Deal changed the relationship between the government and the people and helped restore hope during hard times as the country struggled to recover from the Depression. New threats emerged overseas in the 1930s. Dictators like Adolf Hitler in Germany and Benito Mussolini in Italy rose to power. Japan expanded its empire in Asia and invaded China. World War II began in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. The United States tried to stay out of the conflict but provided aid to Britain and other allies through the Lend-Lease program. Everything changed on December 7, 1941, when Japan attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The United States declared war on Japan, and soon after on Germany and Italy. Millions of Americans joined the armed forces and the country mobilized for total war. Factories produced weapon ships and planes at an unprecedented rate. Women and minorities took on new roles in the workforce. War was fought on two main fronts, Europe and the Pacific American, and Allied forces landed in North Africa, Italy and France, fighting their way toward Germany. In the Pacific, they fought island by island against Japanese forces. The war ended in 1945 after the Allies defeated Germany and the United States dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. World War II was the deadliest conflict in human history and left much of the world in ruins. The United States emerged as a global superpower and played a leading role in creating the United Nations to promote peace and cooperation among nations. At home, the war brought major changes. The economy boomed, and millions of Americans moved to cities and suburbs. The GI Bill helped returning soldiers go to college and buy homes. African Americans and women who had contributed to the war effort began to demand more rights and equality. The stage was set for the next era of American history as the country faced new challenges in the post-war world. After World War II, the United States emerged as one of the two superpowers in the world. Along with the Soviet Union, the two countries had very different political and economic systems and soon became rivals in a struggle known as the Cold War. The United States promoted democracy and capitalism, while the Soviet Union supported communism and authoritarian rule. The Cold War was not a direct military conflict, but a competition for influence around the world. Both sides built up huge arsenals of nuclear weapons and tried to spread their ideas to other countries. In the late 1940s, the United States helped rebuild Western Europe through the Marshall Plan, providing billions of dollars in aid to help countries recover from the devastation of war. The United States also helped create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, a military alliance to defend against Soviet aggression. The Soviet Union responded by forming its own alliance called the Warsaw Pact. World was divided into two camps, and tensions ran high at home. The United States experienced a period of economic growth and prosperity. Millions of Americans moved to the suburbs and started families in what became known as the baby boom. New technologies like television, air conditioning, and interstate highways changed the way people lived. The 1950s were a time of optimism but also of fear, as Americans worried about the threat of nuclear war. Schools held air raid drills and families built bomb shelters in their backyards. The Cold War turned hot in some places, as the United States and the Soviet Union supported opposing sides in conflicts around the world. In 1950, war broke out in Korea when Communist North Korea invaded South Korea. The United States led a United Nations force to defend South Korea, and after 3 years of fighting, the war ended in a stalemate, with the country still divided. Today, the struggle for civil rights became a major issue in the United States. During the 1950s and 1960s, African Americans and their allies fought to end segregation and discrimination. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X inspired millions to demand equality. The Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that segregated schools were unconstitutional. Peaceful protests, marches, and boycotts challenged unjust laws. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were landmark laws that banned discrimination and protected the right to vote. The 1960s were a time of great change and turmoil. John F. Kennedy was elected president in 1960 and inspired the nation with his call to ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Kennedy faced major challenges, including the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when the world came Close to nuclear war, he also launched the space race with the Soviet Union, promising to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Tragically, Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, and Lyndon B. Johnson became President. Johnson pushed for the Great Society, a set of programs to fight poverty and expand civil rights. The United States also became more involved in the Vietnam War conflict that divided the nation and led to widespread protests. In 1969, American astronauts landed on the moon, fulfilling Kennedy's promise and marking a major achievement in science and technology. The 1970s brought new challenges, including the Watergate scandal, which led to the resignation of President Richard Nixon. The country faced economic problems like inflation and an energy crisis. The Vietnam War ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon and the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule. The late 1970s and 1980s saw a conservative shift in American politics. Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980 and promoted lower taxes, less government regulation, and a strong military. Reagan's policies helped end the Cold War as the United States increased pressure on the Soviet Union. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell and communist governments collapsed across Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991 and the Cold War came to an end. The United States was now the world's only superpower. The 1990s were a time of economic growth and technological innovation. The rise of the internet and personal computers changed the way people worked, communicated, and learned. Bill Clinton was elected president in 1992 and presided over a period of prosperity and budget surpluses. The country faced new challenges, such as the Oklahoma City bombing and debates over health care and trade. In 2000, George W. Bush was elected president after a contested election. On September 11, 2001, terrorists attacked the World Trade Center in New York City and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., killing nearly 3,000 people. The attack shocked the nation and led to the War on Terror. The United States invaded Afghanistan to remove the Taliban and hunt down Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq to remove Saddam Hussein from power. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq lasted for many years and were controversial at home and abroad. The 2008 financial crisis caused a severe recession and millions of Americans lost their jobs and homes. Barack Obama was elected president in 2008, becoming the first African American to hold the office. Obama's administration passed major reforms in health care, known as the Affordable Care Act, and worked to recover from the economic downturn. The country also saw major social changes, including the legalization of same-sex marriage by the Supreme Court. In 2015, in recent years, the United States has faced new challenges and divisions. Political polarization has increased, and debates over immigration, race, climate change, and the role of government have become more intense. The 2016 election of Donald Trump brought new controversies and changes in domestic and foreign policy. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 caused widespread illness and death and disrupted daily life and the economy. The country responded with vaccines and public health measures. But the crisis revealed deep inequalities and divisions. In 2021, Joe Biden became president and focused on recovering from the pandemic, rebuilding the economy, and addressing issues like climate change and racial justice. The United States has continued to play a leading role in world affairs, supporting allies in Europe and Asia and responding to new threats and opportunities. The country remains a place of innovation, diversity, and resilience. Americans continue to debate the meaning of freedom, equality, and democracy as they face the challenges of the 21st century. From the struggles of the early colonies to the rise of a global superpower, the history of the United States is a story of change, conflict, and hope. It is a story of people from many backgrounds coming together to build a nation and shape the future. Journey continues as each new generation writes its own chapter in the American story.